My name is LJ Stambuk. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. It is my pleasure and honor to greet you here today and to thank the Honorable Paul Dabbar coming all the way from Washington, D.C. to be with us. I also want to thank Jeff Merrifield and David Doctor for making this visit happen today. Thank you so very much, Jeff and David.
It is great to have all of you here. My name is Jeff Merrifield. I'm the chairman of E4 Carolinas, which is delighted to be a participant in the work that LJ has done here for this particular event today. First I want to do is thank LJ and the entire World Affairs Council team. The Undersecretary has spoken to a variety of World Affairs Councils around the country, but I think the turnout that we've had today and the energy that he has seen in his visit has been really extraordinary. Before I introduce the Secretary, just a couple of comments. I am a local. I live in Davidson, North Carolina, and have been here since 2007. I work for Pillsbury Law Firm, which is an international law firm. About half of our business is outside of the United States, and I lead the world's oldest and largest nuclear law practice in that regard, and we were involved in those kind of projects all over the world, and as a result of that came into contact with our speaker, the Honorable Paul Dabbar, in various times there. Just a quick word about E4 the Carolinas, if you haven't heard of us. We've been around since 2012. We are the Carolinas' largest all-in energy association, representing members in both North and South Carolina, from Wilmington, where we have members such as GE, through the Research Triangle area, through the center of our location here in the Charlotte region, and running all the way down to Charleston, where we have Clemson among many of our members with a very large energy facility down there. We've been involved in networking in a variety of areas in the energy sector. 150 members full-time. We have another 100 associate members. We represent all of the electric generating utilities in the Carolinas, suppliers, universities and colleges that are interested in the energy arena, and a variety of other supportive individuals and entities. 5 key areas for us in our efforts in the course of the next several years: electrification of vehicles, battery and large-scale energy storage, smart grid activities, much of that is revolving around Raleigh and the Research Triangle area, advanced construction, and this is an effort led in no small part by the Engineering, Production, and Infrastructure Center up at UNC Charlotte, and finally, the next generation of advanced nuclear power plants. So all of those major initiatives, and look forward to continuing to work with the World Affairs Council in that regard. My primary duty is to introduce the Honorable Paul Dabbar. He is the Undersecretary for Science and serves as the department's principal advisor on fundamental energy research and energy technologies. He is responsible for managing a majority of DOE's national labs and their world-leading user facilities, as well as managing the environmental and legacy missions of DOE that address the U.S. legacy of nuclear weapons production and nuclear energy research. Previously, Paul served as a managing director at J.P. Morgan, where he was a mergers and acquisitions lead for over $400 billion in energy investment, including solar, wind, geothermal, distributed generation, utility, LNG pipeline, oil and gas, trading, and energy technologies. And he has also led the majority of their nuclear transactions over more than almost 2 decades. Before joining J.P. Morgan, Paul served as a nuclear submarine officer in Mare Island, California, and in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, including deployment to the North Pole, where he conducted environmental research. Paul received his BS degree from the U.S. Naval Academy and an MBA from Columbia University. For those of you who don't know him, I can relate that Paul is an inquisitive, insightful, and highly regarded thought leader in the energy industry, and it is a real privilege that we were able to get time on his schedule to come to this and the other many events in which he has participated during his visit to Charlotte. And with that, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Paul Dabbar.
Thanks. I've been here many times over the years doing energy work with with many companies here over the years, and it's great to be back, and it's great to see the breadth of everything that's going on in this area around innovation, the university systems, the energy business, and I'll talk about our kind of interaction. I'm going to talk through what we do at the department, which I think most people have no idea what we do. And my goal for you is that hopefully the significant majority of you all will leave here more positive about where this country is going from the point of view of innovation and also for humanity. Let me talk a little bit about what we do, and it will obviously layer in to the international aspects, the world aspects on multiple different areas that you can probably start hearing about as I go through the description. So the Department of Energy is probably much misnamed. It would be better named if it was called the Department of Energy, Science, and Defense Programs. Those are the three different areas of the department. That's a horrible name, but it would be a better descriptor. But the department was effectively started by a recommendation. The predecessors of the department was effectively started by a recommendation by Albert Einstein. And so to remind people who know about the history of physics and a number of other things, Albert Einstein, Leo Szilard, Enrico Fermi identified people who had been fleeing Nazism and fascism, had identified that a number of their physics partners that had stayed behind, including Heisenberg, they were working on fissioning uranium that could be made into a weapon. And 80 years ago, this last summer, Einstein wrote a letter to FDR pointing that out, and that he would recommend that the government would enter into a formal permanent working with the physicists that he identified in his letter to try to do something about this. This recommendation led to the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project, the core of the Manhattan Project was at 3 national labs that were started from scratch. That's Oak Ridge National Lab, Los Alamos, and Hanford, led by people such as Enrico Fermi and Robert Oppenheimer from New York. After the end of World War II, Vannevar Bush, who was the head of the Manhattan Project in Washington, D.C., decided that he wanted that this group of scientists that came from all around the world, obviously because of fleeing the war, who came to the original National Lab Complex, who were the leaders in physics, in materials, in chemistry, should also do cutting-edge science, both in regular science as well as energy science. And he got Congress to create the National Science Foundation and the National Lab Complex. From those 3 labs and the original people who were at those 3, it has expanded to 17 national labs. And I get to manage and deploy capital across that complex. It is 60,000 researchers who operate at the National Lab Complex across the 17 sites. It is the largest R&D organization in the world. A few other data points about this and a little bit about the history. 40% of all the Nobel Prize winners in the world in physics and 25% of all the Nobel Prize winners in the world in chemistry were researchers who did their research in our national labs. We are the drivers of basic science for those particular areas globally. Since the founding of the complex, Fermi, Lawrence, Teller, Seaborg, and Rickover started whole programs that changed the world. What had happened as things moved on is that the energy crisis, I think is now getting a little bit closer to history, people may remember, that the energy crisis that precipitated from the 73 Arab-Israeli war which the OPEC oil embargo, and for those of you who are old enough to remember that, the OPEC oil embargo slapped on the United States, which caused gas lines. And I was growing up in Oklahoma at the time, and there were gas lines in Oklahoma, okay? Very strange for today's world to be thinking about that, but that's what it was like back then. And President Carter, who went to my undergrad university, who was far more successful than I am, decided to stand up the department to address this energy shortage. And he laid out a series of things that basically, he said that we were not going to find enough energy in this world, and that we needed to basically figure out how to make do with less. And he wore the sweaters and the sweater speeches, and he banned natural gas use for power, and he banned this and he banned that. And that turned out to be the wrong solution. The solution was innovation. And the National Lab Complex, which is the core of the department, out of the 115,000 people who work at the department, the majority of it are the researchers who work across the complex associated with that. Since then, major things have been invented. It's too long a list, but nuclear power, nuclear medicine, the MRI, the white LED light, 22 elements have been identified in the National Lab Complex. We co-led the Human Genome Project. Most people don't realize that gene sequencing was actually identified at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which we run, one of our labs. We detected the neutrino. We identified how dark energy and dark matter work, how quarks and gluons come together to create protons and neutrons, and formed the universe. And the National Lab Complex is a world leader in supercomputing. Most people don't realize that. The top supercomputers in the world since the advent of supercomputing of the Cray 1 have been built and combined and designed and deployed in the National Lab Complex that we run. And just this last year, as a data point, we deployed the number 1 or number 2 supercomputers. We're never happy. We're building the next number 1, number 2, and number 3. Each one's going to be able to do an exaflop. An exaflop that's 10 to 18th calculations per second of calculation, which just as a measure of, it's hard to get your hands around numbers that large. There's been half an exaseconds since the founding of the Big Bang. So every second we can do calculations 2 times equivalent to the number of seconds since the Big Bang, every second. And the number of AI calculations, which are called exaops, same degree, 10 to the 18th, we're going to be able to do 3 exaops. So it's 6 times the number of seconds since the Big Bang. The complex, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the details of the sort of things that we work on to 60,000 people. But to a large degree, the way I like to describe it is that we are leaders in innovation of a portion of this very large innovation complex that we work with universities, work with the private sector, and across the board. And innovation is creating solutions to humanity's problems. And the degree to which that the pace of the solutions to humanity are created is a measure of our prosperity. And the pace that we're able to do it is equal to our economic growth rate ultimately at the end of the day. So we're here to help identify solutions, and we want to work with the private sector to help deploy those solutions, and that's what drives the economy, and that's what drives what we do, and there's so many different areas that we do that with. Let me talk to you a little bit about where I see us. I talked a little bit about history. Let me talk to you a little bit about current, and hopefully, I think a lot of people don't particularly follow a lot of things in Washington that actually really happen. Most of Washington is not what you click on a website. It is not what you read in a newspaper. 95%. And from my point of view, 100% of my experience of being in this current job has been about bipartisan support for innovation. I have as, it is easy, it's as easy for me and the rest of the leadership team, Secretary Perry and the others, to work with Senator Schumer and Senator Durbin as it is with Senator Alexander. Because at the end of the day, supporting innovation, supporting economic development, competitive advantage of us in the world, which is in large part driven by our innovation and our technology and being able to deploy it, is not a topic of high controversy. Since we have been there, since this leadership team has been there, the funding for our lab complex is up 25%. That is a massive amount of money. If you look at the 60,000 people, we spend about $14 billion a year in non-defense R&D. It is a very, very large amount. It swamps anything of any company that you can think of. And that very large increase is at the high end of a wave that's happened here in Washington that if you look across the board in terms of the innovation spend from the federal footprint, that it's all at all-time highs. They're all up a very large amount of money. So that's NASA, the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation. This is where we're going on genomics. This is us going to Mars. And sincerely, we talk about going to Mars in my office a lot. And it's not a theory. It's actually what equipment do we need to make at a national lab? What things need to happen to detectors? How can we deploy nuclear power in rockets that will get us to Mars in half the time? That solves a lot of problems. And refueling instead of having to build a refinery on Mars. These are real things that we actually talk about every day, work with the Jet Propulsion Lab, NASA, National Institutes of Health. Sickle cell anemia looks like it's been cured. First genetic disease looks like we've been able to actually solve it. And Dr. Francis Collins and team at NIH looks like they've solved the first genetic disease. And it's really at the cusp, at the very pointy end of a spear of 4,000 to 5,000 genetic diseases that might be able to be solved the same way through gene sequencing and gene editing. And one other kind of interesting data point, for those of you who know, Jennifer Dauda invented gene editing. She was from Berkeley. And the funding for her first bit of research that came out of her, at the time, crazy idea of how to actually edit genes was funded by Lawrence Berkeley, a DOE national lab. So that's where she got the first money associated with it. A big part of the $14 billion that we spend every year is not only on the 17 national labs and the 60,000 people, but it's also, we're one of the largest funders to universities in the country, along with NIH and the National Science Foundation and others. We put about $3 billion a year out to various grants all around the country. And so I have a whole team who does basically manages where the next research is interesting, where to put out those grant proposals, the funding opportunities out to the university system, collect those, do peer review processes, and then fund the very top end, what we see most interesting coming out of the university system. I spend a significant amount of time, probably the largest amount of time, with the university systems around this country, and try to make a difference from that point of view. So talking a little bit about technology and where I see things going, I think that there are 6 particular areas that we as humanity are on the cusp of making major differences for where we are going. They are artificial intelligence and machine learning, quantum information science, space and universe exploration, advanced and sustainable energy, advanced mobility, and genomics. Each and every one of these areas is obviously a whole line of massive numbers of people. It's hard to describe all of those. I'll give you a quick smattering. Obviously, AI is a very interesting area. There's obviously us running the top supercomputers in the world, including the top AI supercomputers in the world, are very much kind of at the front end of the hardware associated with it, and ergo our researchers are building algorithms on that to drive that. There's tremendous amounts of industrial applications, so building AI algorithms to run a car manufacturing plant, a refinery, a chemical plant, a grid operation, a power plant. I could keep going. The energy to run this building, there's probably no one turning on and off these lights and trying to optimize the energy and the costs associated with it. There's tremendous applications associated with that. And then one thing that I find particularly interesting, which is way at the front end of where AI is, far beyond what normal people talk about, which is data pattern recognition and image capture, which is actually building AI algorithms to learn first principles of science to design molecules. So you're a researcher at a university, you're trying to design a molecule for a piece of biology, for a biotech drug, you're trying to design a material for carbon capture, any number of things. To build out AI algorithms to basically be the professor who can learn the first principles associated with that particular molecule, come up with the ideas of how to drive it, what lab research is required for people to go off and do it, and feed it back into the loop until we're able to solve a particular problem. That's actually very interesting from the front end. I'll hit another one, quantum information science. I think as many of you know, the basis of our digital technology is just a bunch of small gates that go from 0 to 1, and how you can cram as many of those onto a chip as possible and how to make them work as fast as possible. For 100 years, since Niels Bohr primarily came up with this concept of quantum mechanics, is how can you take an individual atom and program the atom through its spin or its energy level or a photon of light, and program data into a photon of light or into an ion and with its spin, and you program it with incredibly tiny lasers, and how to put data onto that rather than on silicon and billions of different transistors. If we had, it's too hard to kind of get into all the details, but the possibility of the sort of things that we're targeting from quantum computing could be a computer that is 1 × 10 to the 16th more powerful than the computers I just described. It is hard to get your hands around that. It is just a monumental number. We also stood up the first entangled quantum internet in the world this last year in Chicago. This is actually being able to transfer the data associated with it. And now I'm going way over the cliff, but I'm telling you this is exactly what we did. The way we transfer entanglement of information from one qubit to another over a distance is effectively teleporting an atom. And there's, in theory, we could actually teleport atoms from place to place. They're not copying, they're the same. And they could be 35 to 50 miles apart and the exact same atom. It's a hard concept to get your head around. Literally, Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein argued. Einstein didn't believe it. There's a lot of great stories about Einstein just didn't believe any of this, and Niels Bohr. This is kind of diving into physics here slightly, which was basically Bohr came up with quantum mechanics, and Einstein came up with his general relativity and classical. And there's still a problem about small versus big, and they don't really match. The rules are different, and exactly how they overlap is still not figured out. There's a lot of things I talked about. Mobility, space into universe exploration is truly amazing. Obviously, a lot of work about things that are very obvious about sending rovers to Mars, sending people to Mars, the moon. We're purchasing equipment to drop onto the moon. Okay, so it's in execution. Their bids are out. Various different companies are bidding to provide different components. And that purchasing and that design and so on for the specific components to have a permanent moon colony is actually in operation. And we detect black holes that collide, or black holes and neutron stars that collide once a week on average somewhere in the universe, and trying to figure out how these work. And everyone's probably seen the picture of the last black hole from a couple of months ago, which was truly an amazing feat, where we basically created a telescope the size of the Earth through basically creating a synthetic aperture array. For any of you from the Navy, right? Mike, you got to be listening to this. Synthetic aperture array, the size of the Earth to take a picture of the black hole. That black hole, by the way, is the size of our galaxy. That black hole is that big. It was a big target, so I guess it made it a little bit easier. So that's what I see as kind of where we're going on the broader points. Let me talk a little bit about energy. Let me talk to you a little bit about policy and how we've been running things. Obviously, if you think about Jimmy Carter's policy was about energy security and how to manage with the lack of energy. Our particular policy, we have two particular points that we focus on: all the above and energy dominance. And quite a bit has happened in both of those particular areas that have significant global, worldwide aspects that I think is quite important. So all the above, as I basically described, we are a very large R&D organization. We do investments in renewables, we do investments in different types of solar, in different types of batteries, in grid operations. You know, we invented nuclear and we put tremendous amounts of money into nuclear innovation. Fusion, by the way, we have 3 companies looking to put a net energy out, 10 to 1 actually is what they're targeting. Prototypes, to actually build them, there's been $1 billion raised in the private markets on top of our $800 million a year that we put in fusion. There's a real possibility that we may have economic net out fusion. So when we think about all the above, us as a leadership team, and once again, we have general concurrence, and as you can see with the large budget increases that have been very bipartisan. Our last budgets were passed in the Senate, as an example. 91 senators voted in support of what we did, our budget. Is that we invest in R&D and technology across the board and let the entrepreneurs and the innovators at universities, at companies, at the National Lab Complex to drive what can be done in terms of innovation in all of the areas. And we're effectively letting the market, right? The market are the researchers, the market are you as innovators, to go ahead and try to put what's going to work. So we're not picking winners and losers. We invest in basic research. As you probably heard, some things, I didn't even talk about dark energy and dark matter. I stopped myself at that point. But obviously, there's a lot that we do in the energy sector, and we don't want to pick the winners. We want to go ahead and invest with all of that and focus on basic research. So we focus on things on the more applied and the more energy areas, to hit that point, is that areas of research that are far enough from cash flow that the private sector won't invest in. The university system does that all day in terms of all different sort of research that you do in all sorts of areas. So the university system basically invests in research and those sort of things. And that's what we do, either directly through our National Lab Complex or through our grant programs through the universities. So we support investing and across the board in all the different areas. And we think from a public policy point of view, we think that this is far more attractive than trying to mandate that this has to be the one technology or that has to be the next technology. But let's talk a little bit about energy technologies, what's happened in the last, let's call it 10 to 15 years. 10 to 15 years ago, we were a massive importer of energy in this country. You just have to kind of remind everyone. It's kind of everyone's so focused on the last click that you don't even, barely remember last month, and certainly not a decade or a decade and a half ago. We were a major importer of energy, which also meant that the jobs associated with energy were effectively not here. Where were they? They were in Venezuela, and they were in Nigeria, and they were in Iran and Saudi Arabia and so on. We bought their product. In the last 10 to 15 years, what's happened? Solar costs have dropped by 90%. Wind capacity factors have increased by 100%. Utility scale batteries from only 18 months ago from a concept are now at base load power plant scale sized, and they're economic without any tax incentives or mandates. Oil and gas production costs dropped by over 70%. And the US right now is the number one producer of crude oil in the world, and the US is the number one producer of natural gas in the world, separately. okay? We're the #1 in both. And obviously, combined between the two, we swamp everybody else. We're the 3rd highest exporter of oil in the world. We're probably going to #1 in the next 5 years at the rate it's going. We'll surpass Saudi Arabia. And if you look at turbine efficiency rates, Siemens is here, right? If you look at turbine efficiency rates, they've improved, give or take, around 22%. That's less emissions, less energy need, and more energy availability. I could keep going. There's many, many technologies, but that's kind of the highlight. And so what we've gone from is a major importer of energy in this country to parity, pretty much, I think, this next year, and a net out. So we will be a net energy exporter in this country for the first time since the 1950s. If you look at the energy jobs in this country as a result of all of that once again, that's all been driven by technology. That's not been driven by government saying you got to do this, you got to do that. This is all driven by innovation, by that federal research that we do, universities, and the private sector, and the deployment, and there's different parts of that. And so tremendous amount of difference that this has had on the economy, on jobs, on energy security around the world. And these things are actually truly amazing about where we're at. Let's talk about energy dominance, the second part of our policy. So if you, and you kind of hit about this from a global point of view, I think there's 3 major areas that I talked about the importance of what I just described from an energy dominance point of view. First of all, for us being going from a big deficit to neutral to an exporter, it has significant economic advantages. And it's not just Houston and so on in northern Alaska. If you look at where the jobs have been from an energy point of view, you look at wind in Oklahoma, there's a significant number of jobs. There's now oil and gas production in Ohio. There's tremendous amounts of solar jobs. And so the economic impact is great. Obviously, if you look at the velocity of money, it's not just the $1 that's spent. If it's spent in a healthy community, it goes 6 to 7 times bouncing around the community. You have to build a home. You have to build roads. The economic impact is great. Secondly, the second point of energy dominance from a global point of view is that as being a net energy exporter, we now have the ability to work with countries that are energy importers that have an alternative to buying energy from countries that many times have political goals that may not be very attractive about how they manage energy exports. These are countries such as Russia, such as Venezuela, such as Iran. Our flexibility to deliver gas to Poland or deliver gas to the Ukraine rather than having to reply take gas from Gazprom is a major geopolitical issue for them. And it allows us to engage with allies who want to work with us and give them energy options that increases their security, and that is obviously incredibly important. Let me give you the strangest one that I've seen. The United Arab Emirates and Abu Dhabi, in particular, is a major exporter of crude oil. They have no natural gas. In order for them to create power, they're actually building some nuclear, but in the absence of that, they need natural gas to run, gas turbines to run, because of their own challenges from their own point of view. This isn't our issue, of dealing with the very large gas country next door in Qatar. They don't actually get along very well. So right now, the majority of the gas which is getting burned in Abu Dhabi is coming from Louisiana and Texas. We're exporting energy to the Middle East, to the Gulf. And by the way, the regas facilities are owned by a company and a person in Tulsa. Okay, so it's a very strange world as we live in, once again, in a very positive way, driven by technology. The third one is national security. A lot of what we do at the department also deals with national security issues. That's a long list. We run the nuclear weapons program for the country. Many people don't, I just described to you the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was started at the national labs. It's still there. The Manhattan Project, we have nuclear weapons in this country and we run them. And as you think about national security, we worry about energy security, we worry about science and technology and people trying to, and us to develop it on our behalf, and people trying to steal it. I'm a major generator of technology and IP. This is a major topic that is far too long for me to get into in this, but it's obviously highly topical. I could maybe answer a question if anyone's interested. But if you take a look at national security policy, we work a lot with DoD. There's a lot of machinery around national security plans. They develop national security plans, what size of fleet we have, where do we deploy troops. You can probably guess there's a giant machine at the DoD and the National Security Council to figure out where we should have troops, which countries we engage with, where we send ships in the South China Sea or the Gulf or so on. And our ability to have flexibility around how we deal with that, or countries like Venezuela with what's going on, and maybe having issues around exports, around our flexibility around exports around oil and Iran and Venezuela, how we deal with the Middle East. Given that we've gone from a massive deficit and needing that energy from, in particular, the Gulf, but elsewhere, to a positive, has strategic flexibility from a national security point of view that has great value to us as a country. Let me talk to you, I'll finalize this and talk a little bit about the top technologies that I see kind of going on in the energy sector. So the top ones that we see is beyond lithium-ion battery chemistries. These are chemistries that are not lithium-ion based. There are other chemistries based that could be 3 to 5 times better than they are today. Imagine you charge up your Tesla and can drive 1,000 or 1,500 miles. It's actually longer than a gas tank. That's a possibility. I talked about AI, perovskite crystals around solar. This is painted on solar. Imagine if you could literally paint on solar detector onto your window of your house, connect it with a couple of electrodes, and you could actually get power. And we do a lot in advanced nuclear, and I talked to you about fusion, which is also incredibly important. We have a lot of interaction, and this will be the last point before I like to take some questions. So if we stop and think about that from a global point of view, a world engagement point of view, I've just, frankly, just sped by what we do on an everyday basis and how we engage. There's massive numbers of things I wasn't able to cover. But just what I just described, think about the global interaction that I just listed and what I just went through. It is massive. It is all over the place, right? If you think about it from a defense point of view, run nuclear weapons. We have a joint nuclear weapons program that we work with the United Kingdom on. It's actually incredibly important. We run non-proliferation for the country, right? There's a reason why nuclear weapon hasn't gone off in this world, in part because the Department of Energy non-pro program, which is quite large, keeps nuclear material safe that might be in a research reactor in some place in Africa, that it's not going to get stolen. But they have a reactor someplace in Africa or at some university. We run the naval nuclear submarine program. So everything that we care about with and carriers. So the nuclear programs of dealing with the design of the reactor components for submarines and aircraft carriers we run. I talked to you about energy. That's obviously very broad globally, which I touched on. And then science. So the broad sciences that I talked about, whether it's quantum, whether it's AI, whether it's supercomputing, whether it's next generation batteries, high energy particle physics, our interaction with the rest of the world is incredibly high. Many of these things that we do, we work jointly with, in particular, with kind of our closest connections who have very large R&D organizations and academic institutions. Europe by far is our biggest, but Canada and Australia and Japan and all of the nations that you would expect. We have giant programs that we build things together. Our biggest collaboration is at CERN in Geneva. For those you may remember, CERN is a giant, large hadron collider. It's some 25 miles long. It just discovered the Higgs boson. The largest funder of CERN is the United States. The largest number of nationalities of people who are there are people from the United States. About 25% of everyone at CERN, largest country at CERN in Geneva, are Americans. And we fund a significant amount of what happens there. I'll give you one exciting one. So there's a little area of CERN outside the Large Hadron Collider that they've named the antimatter factory. They take positrons, they take negative antiprotons, combining it with positrons to make antihydrogen, and they're doing tests to see if antimatter operates any differently than normal matter. That's one of the things that we fund at CERN. And vice versa, they come in and fund our facilities at one of our national labs, Fermi National Lab in Chicago. And the last thing that I will say that many people don't realize about the giant footprint that we have across the 60,000 people, we have facilities that generate neutrinos that shoot from Illinois to South Dakota, no joke, through the Earth to try to determine how neutrinos work and how the universe was formed. We build light sources that are basically large X-ray machines. We have 3 of those. 2 of them are larger than Yankee Stadium. There's one thing after another of gigantic scale that not even the Harvards and the Stanfords and their endowments can build. That's a value of what the federal footprint does. These are open for researchers around the world based on merit-based reviews of their proposals, and they can come from anywhere in the world to come and use our facilities to test what they want to do, and it is free if they publish. This is about open science. There's a longer conversation about how we work with industry, which is actually vast. But just from an open science point of view, you could be from Harvard, you could be from Davidson, you could be from Paris, you could be from Geneva, you could be from University of Tokyo. If you put a pitch in to us and say, I would like some time to be on this facility to do an experiment on this, on a dark matter research or next generation batteries. And it goes through a review process because we obviously have a finite amount of use time, that it is open to them and it will be free for them to do their research. The United States is only 5% of the population of the world. And by the way, we're only like 3% of the younger generation. And so the light that we continue to shine from the very beginning of the National Lab Complex of having open access, transnational, merit-based use of what you all build as build that I'm lucky enough to manage for a few years. You should probably guess this is actually a really exciting job. Is a light to the world of bringing in students, bringing in people who come here. Many of them stay. 4 of my 17 national lab directors were originally from overseas. Almost a quarter of the people who run my national labs came from overseas originally. And by the way, Fermi Labs is completely overrun with Italians. They're like, I'm certain it's the name. No, but they're also very good at high energy particle physics. So I've given you a very quick overview. It's hard to describe the place. It's hard to describe the scope. It's too broad. Now you at least hopefully understand why I think the department is probably much misnamed, calling it the Department of Energy. But as I said up front, hopefully, my goal here was for you to feel more positive than when you came in. Hopefully you see that where we are as a country, where we are as humanity, in terms of where we are with science and technology and what's in front of us, what we're working on, what your tax dollar has supported, and how we interact with the world makes a difference. So glad to take some questions.
Thank you, Paul. I'm Mike Hawley, a board member of the World Affairs Council and actually corporate counsel for E4 Carolinas as well. We're going to cram as many questions into this as we can in 10 or 15 minutes so we can keep Paul on schedule. If you will, get my attention, keep them short, and have questions at the end of them. Yes, right here, please. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. My name is Emily Phil from Duke Energy. I run our federal policy shop. I love my job, but after listening to you, I want to work for you. My question is about carbon capture. That's
Yeah.
top of mind for us. What are the labs doing on carbon capture?
Yeah, so I'll get a little bit into science here about how we kind of manage things. So, if you may think about Edison basically, I forget how many, but he spent a lot of time in the lab coming up with one material after another until he figured out that carbon covered cotton, that burned long enough. That took a lot of effort for him to just keep guessing and guessing and guessing. That's not the best way to do it. Using supercomputers to design molecules that have certain aspects, including porosity and so on, because we could go through, for carbon capture materials, over 1 million different sorts of materials that we think can work. And what we've actually identified at one of our national labs, and right now, carbon capture, and I know with Duke and Duke's history of one of the plants, is historically been relatively complicated chemical processes that are expensive. Looks like we've actually come up with a film, like a bag house, like a piece of plastic, in which it will just screen out carbon dioxide. It will only allow carbon dioxide to go through the film. No chemical process, just like a filter. And it looks like we may have gotten the cost down to $60 a ton. And when I talked to the researchers, I said, how much more can you do this? Because they haven't decided to roll it out yet in terms of actual bench testing, because they think they haven't done enough in the lab. And they said, based on our modeling and based on what we think we may be able to get out of the expectation of how the molecules of the film would work, we could maybe get it down to $30 a ton. So if we could deploy something that looks like a bag house to control ash, but instead it filter out carbon dioxide, and that's how complicated it is, and if we can get it down to $30 a ton, I think it's going to make a difference.
You're about to get a question on hydrogen, Stan, and make it a question.
China and Japan and South Korea combined to lead the hydrogen transition. And I'd like to know what we're doing. Of course, Secretary Chu backed us out of it for a while. But I know Dr. Sunita Satyapal is got a hydrogen rail project that we're very interested in. Could you say anything?
Yeah. So once again, we're not picking and choosing. So we actually do support it, and once again, supporting it meaning supporting R&D, less deployment. We don't do deployment. Companies. So we do work with Toyota, who's looking at hydrogen deployment around cars. They pay us. I didn't get into this. We're in part also a contract researchers. If companies come to us and pay us to do research, we will take their money. We will do the research that they pay us for. The IP will belong to them. So we're glad to use our capabilities to fund it, as well as our funding for our own research for our own IP. So we're doing that with Toyota specifically from a light passenger vehicle point of view. But let me tell you an interesting one that are going on. And the problem is I got 60,000 people. It's impossible to keep track of everything that's going on because it's always generating new things. But here's an interesting one. We're working with Sempra, with Southern California Gas, on a renewable natural gas stream, which is actually really interesting, in which we take renewable, this is almost like an alternative to battery storage, where we can store energy in hydrogen or in this case, renewable natural gas as it takes it down the chain. So we actually have just started deployment of a test bed of a scale, so not in the lab, of this chain I'm about to describe. Take renewable power, so it could be solar or wind, obviously breaking apart and creating hydrogen associated with it, and then taking renewable hudrogen through a bioreactor to create and pull carbon out of the atmosphere and create with a bioreactor synthetic renewable methane, which is synthetic natural gas that's renewable because we produced it from renewable power. And we've pulled carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to make the synthetic, the renewable natural gas. We can pipe it. It's now normal pipe stuff and can be run at a power plant. And it's now carbon neutral because the carbon that we pulled out to combine it with the hydrogen to turn it into renewable natural gas can now be burned at a zero carbon basis. So I don't know if that's going to make sense economically. Once again, we're at the basic side. Will it be better than a battery, right? In which you just convert it from renewable power to battery storage, and then you move it versus electric. I don't know, but that's not actually our job. Our job is, if it's something interesting, it's a possibility, we think it's good to support it on the basic side, and actually we have a corporate sponsor to support that.
So we've got time for one more. Yes, sir. Yeah. You're going to close it up.
Yeah, no problem. So touching a little bit on what you said.
Could you stand up? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, Eli Corey with our food family. Thank you so much for speaking today. I wanted to touch a little bit on in this question when you said that you take money from private companies to research specific topics. Was it Tesla that reached out to you to research the innovation, the lithium-ion batteries? And how does the private sector get access to that technology after you develop it?
Yeah, so I'll talk about batteries, and so we do work with Tesla. So we're the largest investor in basic science around next generation battery chemistries in the world. And so this is beyond lithium ion. This is lithium metal. This is sulfur. This is non-vanadium flow batteries, so organic flow batteries. These are different chemistries that can happen that could have the ability to have 3 to 5 times performance. One of the exciting things that has an application of this is that we might be able to hit various performance metrics, and we're working with private companies who are looking at drones to carry people to replace cars. So imagine you parking a drone in your driveway with autonomous, this gets people scared, but just work with me, autonomous flying software, who's big enough that you can get out there with your family, it would take off, quadruped, fly to the grocery store, you go get your food, you jump back in your drone, it takes you back, and we're all feeling like the Jetsons or Star Wars right now, and this is not theory, right? And so a lot of this has to do with battery research and battery technologies. It's really exciting stuff that's going on in a number of areas. If I haven't convinced you, I apologize. I've been trying my hardest. And so we have 11 of 17 of our national labs are doing battery research on these different topics. But in addition to that, we work with companies both on the next generation battery chemistries, but we also work with companies with current lithium ion. We don't focus on it as much because that's a commercialized technology, but there's still science that obviously can be improved with lithium ion. We don't put our own research dollars against it, but we have significant chemical resources at our national labs who are focusing on all the really exciting stuff, but they know actually how to look at dendrite formation and so on associated with even current technologies with lithium ion. And so we take money from Tesla to do work for them. We have 80 companies at Argonne National Lab alone working on battery technologies. 80. At one of the 11 that do battery work. So exactly did they call us or we call them? Who knows, right? I mean, it's a little bit of probably all met each other at some conference on Sand Hill Road. We got a lab on Sand Hill Road and 430 acres on Sand Hill Road, which we could sell just to fund ourselves for a while. But we work with all of them. We have I'll tell you the last one, and I'll need to move on. At the National Renewable Lab outside of Denver, NREL, which we do solar and wind, and renewable natural gas and hydrogen work that I was talking about earlier. We have a test bed in which the big 3 auto companies have jointly come together to build a test bed and to do research on electric vehicle components. And we have this giant, basically it's like a football field sized room with just engines, right, connected with detectors that they gave us, that they're funding us to go do that. And so it has battery work. It's not Tesla, but it's the others. On that particular one, we do lots of things. And just to talk about economics and where we are as a country, which is a very big part of what we're doing. For us to support people who are building, it's us and one other country, and it's not in Europe, in terms of really are the leaders of a lot of these battery technologies, I think, going forward and how they can be deployed into EVs. We obviously will support companies, and those three got together, and we very much appreciate that we could help out this country with some of our testing capabilities and some of the people that we have as a national resource.
So on the theory that you can never have enough Oklahoma natives up on a stage, only one of whom understands antimatter, please welcome the chair of the World Affairs Council, Wayne Cooper.
On behalf of the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council, we want to present you with this token.
Thank you.
Oh, this is you're the first recipient of this. And we thank you so much. What a fascinating program, Paul. Thank you so much. This is I don't know if you're like me. I thought of so many people I would have loved to hear that presentation. And I thought about the person that developed how to photograph the black hole. She's 28 years old, female. I think what an achievement that she did what science throughout history of trying to figure out how to do. Thank you all so much for being there. We encourage you to join and hear more programs like this. So we thank you for that, and we'll see you at the next program. Thanks.